Let's rewind the clock back to 25 years ago, to the year 2000. At this point in time, superhero media was already becoming more and more mainstream, thanks to some of the TV shows in the 90s and the long-lasting legacy of the characters. As far as video games go though, the only superhero games we really had were just those 2D beat-em-ups, and the infamously bad Superman game for the Nintendo 64. Even if some of those 2D games were good, we had yet to see a superhero game that really blew audiences away. However, this finally changed in August of 2000, when Spider-Man released on PS1, N64, Dreamcast, and PC. In honor of the game's 25th anniversary, I'm going to be reviewing it. The particular version that I'm playing for this video is the Dreamcast version running on an emulator, since the Dreamcast version is the one that I grew up with, and it's also the superior of the 3 different console versions of the game. Right off the bat, a cool little detail I'd like to point out in this game is that each chapter of the game has its own comic cover. This is a small thing, but it really goes a long way to show that this game is proud of being inspired by the comics. I wish the MCU felt like that nowadays, but I digress. So the game starts out with Doctor Octopus, who is supposedly reformed, giving a presentation on his latest invention. But before he can properly show it off, an imposter posing as Spider-Man appears on stage, steals his invention, and notices that Eddie Brock captured photos of the incident, so he breaks the camera and makes his getaway. The thought of Eddie losing his job because of Spider-Man haunts him, so he ends up transforming into Venom to settle the score with him. The game shows silhouettes of the masterminds behind everything, but it's pretty clear that it's supposed to be Doc Ock and Carnage. The villains release a poisonous fog in the city that covers all the streets. A lot of games back in this era had fog in order to save rendering, but I think it's an absolute stroke of genius that this game actually provided a reason within the story for the fog being there. Then the game drops you into a tutorial narrated by none other than Stan Lee himself.
Welcome, true believers and newcomers alike. Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee here. Once again, we find our hero Peter Parker, better known around the world as the Amazing Spider-Man, in a heap of trouble. But this is just the beginning, Spidey fans. So get ready for a true superhero action thriller, packed to the brim with thrills and chills, twists and turns, more supervillains than you can shake a web at, and of course, non-stop web-slinging, wall-crawling action.
Let me also just say that right off the start, this game proves that it's not pulling any punches. Sometimes games can have a slow start, but we're only 3 minutes in, and we've already established several Spider-Man villains working together, deadly fog, and Spider-Man being framed for a crime he didn't commit. All the pieces of the puzzle are perfectly laid out in the beginning, and I love that. Black Cat tells us about a bank robbery, so you spend a couple of levels swinging through the city to get to the bank, taking out the mercenaries and rescuing hostages. A bank heist is such a classic way to incorporate some action into a story, so I think it's a really cool way to start out the game's first chapter. And it's a great way of also reminding us that Spider-Man is a street-level superhero that deals with both small-time and big-time threats. Later that night, Peter gets a phone call from J. Jonah Jameson that he's being attacked by Scorpion, which kicks off a level where you have to get to the Bugle before time runs out, and a boss fight against Scorpion ensues. After saving Jonah, we meet up with Daredevil and talk to him about being framed, in which he agrees to spread the word about Spider-Man's innocence. But right as he leaves, a police helicopter shows up, so you spend the next couple of levels traversing through the city while the officers chase you down, until the chopper ends up hitting a radio tower. We see Black Cat again, and she tells us about Venom talking on the screens in Times Square, and Rhino going on a rampage at Omnitech.
One of those famous spitballs.
Whoa, okay. I completely forgot that he said that, and I'm surprised that they got away with that in an E-rated game. Venom talks about having MJ held captive and that she has 24 hours to live, so Kat offers to handle Rhino by herself, but Peter denies that and agrees to go with her to stop Rhino first, and then find Venom, because he can't ignore the urgency of Rhino's rampage. When they arrive, they're too late to stop the technology heist, and Rhino ends up injuring Felicia, so Spidey has to take him on solo. After beating Rhino, he hides as he watches Octavius assist the police with taking Rhino into custody, and starts to consider that possibility that Otto could be reformed after all. However, as Felicia gets taken into the ambulance, she tries to warn Peter that they're not real paramedics, but she is unable to finish her sentence before they close the doors and drive off. The next day, Peter talks to Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four on top of the Statue of Liberty about how to find MJ, and just as Johnny said, Venom ended up finding him first, which leads to a level where you have to chase Venom through the city until he leads Peter into an alley for a boss fight, topped off with an incredible reference to the 1979 film The Warriors.
Spider-Wars! Come out and play!
During their battle, Venom retreats into his hideout in the sewers, and Peter follows, as he ends up finding the Lizard's henchman. This is an Easter egg that I didn't know until around 12 years after I played this game, but in one of the sewer levels you can actually find the Lizard, in which he explains that Venom imprisoned him and took control of his minions, and he'll tell you how to traverse the rest of the stage to find MJ. It's always cool to discover new things in old games. I feel like there isn't as much of this kind of stuff nowadays as there was back then. Once we find MJ, there's another Venom boss fight where you have to fight Venom while also preventing him from turning on the switches in the stage that will cause MJ to drown once the water level is high enough. After the boss is over, Peter questions Venom's motives, in which he explains the fact that he saw Spider-Man steal Octavius's invention, so Peter has to spell things out for him and tell him that they were in the crowd together and that Spider-Man was an imposter. So Eddie lets him off the hook and they form an alliance to find out who the imposter is. I always love seeing stories where Spider-Man and Venom put their differences aside to team up against a bigger threat. Unfortunately, this was one of the last instances of this, but who knows, maybe we'll see something like this in the Insomniac universe someday. As they try to figure out who the imposter is, they head to the Bugle to use the computer database, and this is where the iconic Surf the Web cutscene happens.
Surf the web, surf the web.
This scene is so funny. Venom being an absolute goofball will never not be entertaining. While they're in the records room, Venom senses Carnage's presence and goes after him, leaving Spider-Man behind as he gets attacked by symbiotes. As he goes through the building, he finds the symbiote generators inside of the printing rooms, and then he comes face to face with his imposter, who turns out to be Mysterio. After beating Mysterio, he tells Spider-Man about the plan to make everyone in New York undergo symbiosis, and that the leaders are in Warehouse 65. While on his way to the warehouse, Spider-Man ends up encountering the Punisher, and he quickly realizes that they have the same target in mind. After fighting more symbiotes in the warehouse, we find Black Cat held captive, and after shutting down all the machinery, the city is now free from the fog, and Black Cat leaves to gain assistance from other superheroes. After they go their separate ways, Peter finds out that Doc Ock and Carnage were the masterminds behind the invasion, and Venom arrives to take on Carnage. After a battle against Doc Ock, Carnage ends up beating Venom, so now Spider-Man has to fight Carnage on his own in a boss fight where you have to use a sonic bubble to separate the symbiote from its host. Just when Peter thinks that the day has been saved, the symbiote ends up using Octavius's unconscious body as a host. Thus marks the first appearance of Monster-Ock in Spider-Man history. I think I speak for most of us when I say that this thing gave me the creeps as a kid. Then a chase sequence ensues where you have to escape from the warehouse while it's exploding. As they reach the exit, an explosion ends up separating the symbiote from Ock's body, and Black Cat shows up inside of a jet with Venom and Captain America. Hey, wait a second. So Spider-Man carries Otto's body out of the building, but Cletus is nowhere to be found. I guess he died in that explosion. Then all the heroes that you met throughout the game celebrate together, and then there's a funny cutscene of all the villains sharing a cell together, in which Doc Ock cannot put up with their antics. Then the game cuts to credits with a great remix of the 1967 Spider-Man theme song. Sometimes remixes are horrible, but this is definitely a remix done right. It maintains the spirit of the original while also modernizing it. Overall, I think the story of this game was brilliant. While it is a bit simplistic, that's part of what makes it work. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. The writing was excellent. They really made each character feel true to their comic comic counterparts. They definitely nailed Spider-Man's personality. I feel like this game came out at a time where there was one general consensus of what Spider-Man was as a character. I feel like that didn't really change until the Ultimate Comics came out. Then it felt like after Chasm 1, every new iteration of Spider-Man was trying to be its own unique thing. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. After all, since this character has existed for over 60 years and has so many beloved stories to his name, you are gonna have to reinvent the wheel at some point. I'm just saying that this game definitely has that classic Spider-Man feel to it. And I'm really glad that this was one of the first pieces of Spider-Man media that I was introduced to, alongside the films starring Tobey Maguire and the 1994 cartoon. Although I will say that this game is pretty much 24/7 Spider-Man action, with no Peter Parker personal life stuff mixed in. But that's not a bad thing at all. The game still accomplishes what it sets out to do very well. I like how this game essentially feels like Spider-Man against the world. I love how unapologetic the game is with how comic book-like it feels. I'd say that other than Ultimate Spider-Man, this is the Spider-Man game that feels the most like the comics. It doesn't take itself too seriously or have any sort of gimmicks. It's not afraid to have some fun with itself. They knew that simply recapturing the feeling of the comics and cartoons would be enough for this game to land. Don't get me wrong, I love more mature Spider-Man stories, but this game goes to show that lighthearted Spider-Man stories can be great too, and that there's room in this world for both. Considering how many villains are in this game, and the fact that this game is only 2 hours long, it's actually impressive that they managed to properly flesh out each one. Although I have to say, as far as the villains go, Venom absolutely stole the show in this game. They found the perfect balance of him being menacing and him being a childish goofball. He's an absolute joy to watch in this game, and Darren Norris did a fantastic job on the performance. I couldn't believe it when I found out a decade ago that this is the guy who voiced Cosmo in Fairly Odd Parents and was the janitor in Big Time Rush. Yeah, that's right, this guy voices Venom.
Meanwhile, New Yorkers, the Venom Marathon will continue! Get back here!
I also thought it was a neat touch that other Marvel superheroes have cameos in this game. I do miss this aspect of pre-MCU Marvel, where other heroes can show up in another character's media without needing to connect it to whatever TV show or movie is upcoming. This game proves that you can have other heroes show up without needing much rhyme or reason for why they're here. Although I was pretty happy that the new Spider-Man cartoon brought this back. Now, to talk about the gameplay, this game is a linear level-to-level beat-em-up with platforming elements. While this game wasn't the first Spider-Man game, it was the first 3D one, so it was a challenge for the developers to really get this right, especially with the hardware limitations of the time. Keep in mind, this was back in the year 2000. 3D gaming was still a relatively new thing, and developers were still experimenting and getting the hang of it. Translating Spider-Man into a 3D gaming space is already a complex task enough as is, due to the character's unique and wide range of abilities, so I'm sure you can imagine that it was a lot harder to pull this off back then than it is now. If they screwed this game up, it would most likely live on in infamy alongside Superman 64.
We knew going in that it was going to be one of the most difficult games you could possibly try to do. The guy can go anywhere.
And then the day we got it working, it was one of the happiest days of my life, I know that.
The developers had a clear vision of what they wanted the game to feel like. As long as it was fun to just maneuver the character, you have something good on your hands. It took some time to get the final product that we have, but in the early stages of development, the game's web-swinging mechanics were going to be completely different. They were originally going to have a system where players would manually target where their webs would attach, and swing off of their targeted web line. However, this system ended up being scrapped because it felt too complicated, as it would be difficult for players to target a web line mid-swing. They also felt like the design aspect didn't mesh well with the character, because Spider-Man should be able to just jump in the air and swing from one building to the next with a simple button press.
If you were Spider-Man, you don't think about where you're going to have to stick your web so that you can swing to the next building.
I wish I could tell you, but it's like I don't do it. Like I don't Like, I don't do breathing. Like, breathing just happens.
I love how right off the bat, the very first thing that the game has you do is web swing. That's so fitting. In order to swing, you jump with the A button and press the right trigger mid-air. 2 webs will be shot out at a time, so once he swings off of 2 webs, you'll have to press the trigger again to keep swinging. You can also cancel a swing by pressing the A button in order to reposition yourself, and in some instances, canceling a swing and then swinging again will actually be faster. When you're swinging, you have to make sure that there's a wall that you'll end up sticking to at the end of your swing or a surface to land on, otherwise you won't be able to swing. Of course, the webs don't actually attach to buildings, they just hang off in the sky, but once again, bear in mind, this was 2000. Actual physics and momentum-based web swinging with webs that actually attach to buildings was still a few years away. Honestly, considering the time that this game came out, the fact that it had web swinging like this at all was impressive. Also, I doubt this was intentional, but the way he swings actually reminds me of the 60s Spider-Man show. I think this style of web swinging is very easy to understand and user-friendly. While there may be some moments here and there where I end up swinging somewhere I didn't want to, these moments are very rare, and I often find myself going where I want to. And I can also do it naturally without thinking too much about it. So the developers definitely accomplished what they set out to do. There is a targeting system in the game where you can hold the left trigger and aim a cursor to choose where you want to swing to, and while the inclusion is appreciated, there's not really much of a need for this. There's only one part of the game where you're required to use this, so outside of that one segment, I don't really use this. There's also a zipline mechanic where you can hold the left trigger and press A to zip up to the ceiling above you. This is mostly used for going through vents, but it's a pretty handy tool to have at your disposal when you need to get to the ceiling quickly. Of course, this game lets you crawl on walls and ceilings, and while wall crawling can sometimes be a bit janky in Spider-Man games, I find that this is one of the games where it feels a lot better. I guess it's due to the fact that you're gonna end up relying on crawling often in this game, so they knew they needed it to control well, whereas it felt more like an afterthought in some of the other games, since you'd mostly use wall running for traversal. The combat has some pretty decent variety to it too. You have different punching and kicking combos, and different web attacks. You can hold down the Y button to tie an enemy in webs, leaving them distracted long enough for you to close in with a melee combo, or with human enemies, you can subdue them entirely. By pressing up on the D-pad and Y at the same time, you can shoot an impact web, which is essentially a web bullet. This is a pretty effective way to damage an enemy or boss. Also, a cool little fun fact for you, the impact web was also referenced in Spider-Man PS4 as one of the gadgets in the game. The creative director of Marvel's Spider-Man 1 and 2, Brian Intihar, actually stated that Spider-Man 2000 was his favorite Spider-Man game, so it was cool to see them take a little bit of inspiration from that game for their Spider-Man franchise. Pressing down and Y will do a web yank, which pulls enemies towards you. Left Y will give you web gloves that increases the damage of your punches, and right Y will activate a web shield that blocks all damage while you're inside of it. And after a few seconds, Spider-Man will break out of the shield and cause a shockwave that will knock enemies back. And it does a little bit of damage, but not much, so I wouldn't really rely on this for damage and only use it for defense. You can also press the X button to break out early. Out of all the web moves, this one consumes the most amount of web fluid, so be aware of that. Overall, I think the combat is pretty varied. Having your melee combos as well as the web moves gives the player a good amount of options in combat. I think it's also worth noting the fact that your web supply is limited in this game. There's a meter for your web fluid underneath of your health bar that also has a number that tells you how many cartridges you have. You can only carry up to 10 at a time, and in order to refill them, you have to collect these pickups that are located throughout the levels. In the final chapter of the game, there's also a power-up that adds magnesium to your webbing, which gives you fire webs to use against symbiote enemies. There's also health pickups in the levels, and if you pick one up while your health is full, you'll hear this classic line.
I'm already at full health.
I like how that's a subtle way to break the fourth wall. There's even a pickup that you can get that gives you the spider armor, which essentially gives you a second health bar. However, it can only be refilled by finding another spider armor pickup. So if you lose your spider armor, the game switches you back to your normal costume, and you lose the extra health that it gives you. While the game gives gives you all of your normal health back when a new level begins, which let me just say is a relief for the levels with symbiote enemies. This does not happen with your spider armor's health bar. The level design in this game is great too. The levels really put your traversal abilities to good use with stuff like trying to get to a destination before time runs out, avoiding the police, chasing a villain, crawling through sewers, and it all builds up to the finale of the game being the ultimate test of your speed. The game is always shaking things up, changing environments, enemy types, and presenting new challenges to the players, so this prevents the game from getting stale and keeps the players on their toes. That's really what a superhero adventure should feel like, so they definitely nailed that aspect. This game only takes about 2 hours to beat, which is pretty short, but short games were the norm back then, so it's not really an issue at all. If it felt like not much really happened within those 2 hours, then obviously the game wouldn't be very good. But with all the changes that happen throughout the game, it really makes the game feel like a 2-hour thrill ride. I also really like the enemy variety in this game. There's standard thugs, mercenaries, police, lizard men, and symbiotes. The fact that the game is always introducing more enemies really helps to avoid it from feeling repetitious. I even like how your standard web attacks aren't very effective against the symbiote enemies in the final chapter of the game, with the exception of the web gloves. It just adds another surprise that causes players to rethink some of their tactics, and adds some difficulty as well. I really enjoyed the boss fights as well. I like how each of them requires a unique solution to beat. I really enjoyed this aspect as it felt very true to classic Spider-Man comics, where Peter typically beat his enemies by outsmarting them. Plus, this game has pretty much all of Spider-Man's most iconic foes in it. The only one that's really missing here is Green Goblin, but even then, there's a secret area in one of the levels where you can find Green Goblin's hideout, so the game doesn't completely ignore him. I also love the way this game depicts the spider sense. The visual effects and sound design for it are just very memorable to me. This is definitely one of my favorite depictions of spider sense. I know that's a pretty niche thing to point out, but I still wanted to regardless. For a game of this era, the camera is pretty good for the most part. The only minor issue I have with it is the fact that in order for the camera to turn, you have to face a different direction and stand still for a second, or you can adjust the camera while you're moving by pressing the left trigger, but I think having the camera pan as you move would have been better. The camera never feels like a big issue though, so it's not really that big of a deal. There's a pretty decent amount of additional content in this game as well. There's a character viewer where you can get a good look at the in-game models, and Stan Lee will talk about the characters. There's comic covers that you can find in the levels that highlight some of Spider-Man's most iconic comic issues, and gives a brief description about them. There's different types of training you can do. There's also a pretty solid suit selection here too. There's a good amount of variety here. Each suit feels like it earns its place on the list, and some of them have different in-game abilities as well, such as the black suit having unlimited webbing, and the suit from Spider-Man Unlimited having an invisibility mode. And last but most certainly not least, there's different cheat codes that you can enter, one of which being a what if mode, where you get to play the whole game again, but with some pretty humorous changes throughout the game. My favorite part of the what if mode has to be the Doc Ock boss fight. This is such a fever dream. The what if mode is just another thing that goes to show how much enjoyment they had while working on this game. The game's soundtrack was composed by Tommy Tallarico, and this soundtrack, consisting of electronic and rock music, is very catchy and memorable to me. Hearing these tunes again in-game while I was playing the game for this video certainly gave me a burst of nostalgia. I miss how the 2000s used a lot of electronic music for Spider-Man media. Stuff like this game, the MTV series, and the Ultimate Spider-Man video game did this, and I felt like it really gave a sense of personality to the character. I find the game's voiceover performances to be very well done as well. It has that Saturday morning cartoon feel to it, which I think suits the game's tone perfectly. Even to this day, I can still imagine these voices in my head when I read classic Spider-Man comics. I've already talked about Darren Norris as Venom, but I'd also like to highlight Reno Romano as Spider-Man and Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. as Doc Ock. Reno Romano had a short run as the voice of Spider-Man, as his first performance as the Web Slinger was in the Spider-Man Unlimited cartoon that aired a year before this game released, and he also reprised his role within both of the PS1 Spider-Man games. Yes, I said both. There's 2 of these games in case you didn't know. And he was supposed to voice Spider-Man in a cameo in an X-Men game, but the cameo ended up being scrapped from the game. Despite his very short run, I still think he's one of the most memorable Spider-Man performances.
Hey, Black Cat, what's going on? Spider sense tingling. Something's going on here. Leave him alone, Chuckles. Spare me the propaganda, okay? This isn't a game, Mysterio. The symbiotes will destroy everything in their path unless I can stop them.
And of course, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. returned as Doc Ock from the 1994 cartoon, and he was the definitive Doc Ock before Alfred Molina's portrayal in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2.
I, Dr. Otto Octavius, vow as a scientist and businessman that my duties to humankind will be fulfilled. A perfect world order. Those who cannot share my vision will be crushed by it.
You will never get past my barrier, Spider-Man.
Overall, Spider-Man 2000 is an experience that is nothing short of unforgettable. When you consider the fact that there weren't any superhero games back then that felt really impressive, and that this game also released 2 years before Spider-Man made his debut on the big screen, it just makes what Neversoft accomplished in this game all the more spectacular. I honestly feel like this game doesn't quite get the recognition it deserves. Don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of people out there who remember this game fondly, but normally when people talk about the superhero games that really broke the mold, they only mention the Spider-Man 2 movie tie-in game or Batman Arkham Asylum. But when you really think about it, those games wouldn't be quite the hits they were if it weren't for the fact that Spider-Man 2000 gave a great blueprint to work off of. I'd say this game was a masterpiece of its time, and it's still a thrill to play 25 years later. So I think this game truly deserves the title of being the first amazing superhero game. I know I've just been praising the game non-stop for the past 26 minutes, but that's just because I genuinely feel like this is a game that got everything right. The only minor gripe I have with this game is the fact that I feel like the camera could be a bit better, and in a few rare instances I could end up doing something I didn't want to, but other than that, I don't really have any complaints with this game. So if I were to give this game a score, honestly, I'd say it's just about an S tier. This was actually one of the very first games I ever played as a kid, so I'm really glad that such a classic was one of my first exposures to gaming. Heck, this was also one of the first pieces of Spider-Man media that I ever indulged in. So this game helped to introduce me to my favorite pop culture franchise of all time. With all of that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching and take care.